I warmly welcome you to today's event. I am Olivia Rope, the Executive Director of Penal Reform International, and I'll be moderating today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with PRI, we are a non-governmental organisation working globally to promote criminal justice systems that uphold human rights for all and do no harm. For over 30 years, we have promoted practical reform of criminal justice systems to bring about systemic and comprehensive change. Before we get started, a couple of house ground rules for today's event. We invite you all to put any questions that you have through the Q&A function. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website and social media sites, YouTube channel, if you want to listen back or share with others. We have Spanish interpretation, so if you would like to listen in Spanish, please click on the interpretation box with the globe at the bottom of the screen. Our colleague Carlos will be speaking in Spanish, so if you want to listen in English at that point, you need to click onto the English channel. So today we're gathering to launch a new guide titled Natural Hazards in Prisons, Protecting Human Rights in Disaster Prevention, Response and Recovery. This guide was generously funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Education and Sport of Liechtenstein, and we want to thank them for their support. We know that natural hazards are increasing in frequency and scale, and we have all read or seen in the news how devastating these can be on populations. We also have read about how these extreme weather events and earthquakes sometimes affect prisons, and often with devastating consequences. This guide, which we have posted on our homepage of our website, it's the first of its kind, and it addresses prison authorities primarily. It seeks to provide practical and in large part low-cost solutions on how prisons can better protect the rights of the people that they are supervising, or they have a duty of care towards during the planning, preparation, and also response, and of course recovery from such natural hazards. So with that short introduction, I'd like to turn to our wonderful panel that we have today, who are going to share their insights into many of the issues around the topic of prisons and natural hazards, particularly the human rights concerns, and also with a focus on practical steps that prisons can take in this area. Firstly, we're honoured to have Mr. Maurice Tedboulbens, the new Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions. Mr. Tedboulbens was appointed in April 2021 by the United Nations Human Rights Council. A citizen of Chile and Argentina, he is a medical doctor specialised in forensic science, human rights and humanitarian action. And he's very warmly welcomed, as he's also a former colleague of PRI, having led our Latin America office in Costa Rica a few years ago. We really welcomed your announcements, Maurice, that your priorities for your tenure include deaths in custody and protection of the right to life in the context of disaster management and response. And so I would like to hand over the floor to you, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. I note that there are some hiccups with the connectivity. I hope that you are actually listening to me all right. Is that wonderful? Wonderful. Thank you so much. Firstly, for the invitation to participate and say a few words in this event, and particularly to accompany the launch of this important, I would say, groundbreaking report, much, if not awaited, necessary. So congratulations as well for filling a conspicuous gap in such an important topic. Coincidentally, actually, I'm in Argentina right now, precisely discussing with public defendants, which form part of a ministry, a special ministry in Argentina that among its main duties is actually um, uh, responsible for protecting, overseeing, and protecting the rights of people deprived of liberty in Argentina. And over the last 2 days, in the context of a training and capacity building of these public officials, the issue of disaster preparedness, mitigation, and response in places of deprivation of liberty came up a few times, not in relation to natural disasters, which are not a sort of a normal occurrence in this country, but certainly man-made disasters resulting from especially issues in connection to care and management of places of detention, and especially fire hazards, which actually have accounted for the loss of many lives of people deprived of liberty in this country. And I took the opportunity to mention the fact that Penal Reform International was launching this report this week, and so there is you already have a guaranteed audience for your report in this part of the world. So I just wanted to mention that. As I actually referred to in my report to the General Assembly of the United Nations last October, which actually is my vision report of sorts for the next 3 years of my tenure as Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions. I do hope to focus on preventive measures as much as possible, and in particular in relation to some topics that I have identified as part of this plan of action for the next few years. And as you mentioned, Olivia, I mean, death in custody is one of them. It's not a new topic. It's a topic that has interested my mandate since its creation nearly 40 years ago, albeit mostly, especially on those early years, in relation to the sort of cases which, the dramatic cases of executions of mostly political prisoners happening in parts of the world like countries under dictatorships in South America and a few other places. However, the daily loss of life, of silent loss of life due to less dramatic circumstances, mostly related to neglect, to lack of access to proper healthcare, nourishment, etc., that happen in places of detention worldwide, have called far less the attention of my mandate and the general human rights protection mechanisms, both of the universal system, the United Nations, and even the regional ones. Perhaps with some exception of the African system, which has been very proactive, and it is not a coincidence that the most important instrument to protect the rights of those deprived of liberty actually was very much developed in Africa. I'm referring to the Mandela rules. So I do hope to shed light on this reality. And one of the aspects that certainly fall within this fact is the one which your report very, very rightly highlights. And I think it's a very, very timely report as well, in view of the growing risk for natural disasters due to global warming, etc. I do remember back in January 2010, I was working for the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time, and was as head of the forensic services of the ICRC. I actually traveled to Haiti just a couple of days after the earthquake that some of you may remember struck that country in January 2010, and which led to the death of tens of thousands of people. And actually, Port-au-Prince, the capital of the country, had collapsed. I mean, it was total chaos. Despite the fact that the country is in a seismic region, and there were and there still are regulations for building regulations and et cetera, for disaster prevention and mitigation. They mostly were not actually implemented, and my role there was to assist in the recovery of the dead and identification of the dead, et cetera, et cetera. But when I arrived, one area that was forgotten by all was actually the one and only prison in Port-au-Prince. Interestingly enough, the prison which had been constructed many years previously was built up to relatively good standards in relation to seismic, anti-seismic engineering, notwithstanding which a good part of the structures did collapse, and a large number of prisoners died as a consequence. And this was actually not in the let's say in the radar screen of what was left of the authorities and the structure. The country was in chaos. And as the ICRC, actually, we were finally tasked with collecting the dead from the prison, and in doing so, it dawned on me, not for the first time, but certainly I never had been confronted with the drama of the fact that those deprived of liberty, how fragile they are in the case and event of catastrophic events or natural disasters, in this case an earthquake. And it is a fact, and it was obvious that with better disaster prevention, mitigation, and response, meaning if the authorities had, for example, been prepared in the case of an earthquake to better manage the movements of prisoners, would have had identified safe places within the prison establishment where, with the first shaking, those deprived of liberty could have moved to, many lives would have been saved. And from then on, I do recall that we had several discussions with ICRC colleagues to precisely address this issue. And the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has been looking into this dimension in many contexts of the world, but 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 at a silent level, and without having produced so far standards which I believe are absolutely necessary to alert authorities on one hand, and make sure that systems are improved to protect lives. This is all in relation to my mandate, based on the fact that that when someone is deprived of liberty, there is, on the part of the detaining authorities, a heightened level of diligence required to protect their lives, and this essentially means when somebody dies in custody, no matter what the cause might be, including an accident, there is a presumption of state responsibility, and if in response to disasters, the minimum necessary steps are not taken due to whatever reasons, there is an element of state responsibility for such deaths, and hence in my report I identified death in custody as a topic which I will focus on during the next 3 years, and also in response to lessons learned over the years, also on disaster prevention, mitigation, and response in relation to the right to life. And what I mean to say here is that in today's world, technology and science provides for means and measures to largely prevent loss of life in the event of natural disasters or man-made disasters. However, as in the case of Haiti, in some contexts, certain natural disasters lead to large numbers of people dying. And in the case of Haiti, and I mentioned this example because it's interesting, on that same year in 2010, just a month after Haiti, Chile, in the southern part of South America, was hit by an even stronger earthquake, which also hit urban areas. But contrary to Haiti, only around 500 people died, which is still a huge number of deaths. It's a tragic loss of life, of course, but it was only a fraction of the probably more than 100,000 people who died in Port-au-Prince. The difference was the level of investment on part of the state in disaster prevention, mitigation, and response. And hence, from that perspective, I do believe, from my mandate's point of view, that there is a level of state responsibility when, due to negligence or whatever other reason, not enough is done to prevent the loss of life. And especially in some particular contexts and areas, and places of detention is precisely one of them. So I'm absolutely delighted, and I celebrate the fact that PRI has come up with this very, very important report, which of course I will refer to in my reports as Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary arbitrary executions. So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to join this important event. Congratulations for this initiative. And I also want to offer my support to promote and help implement this important report. So thank you once again, Olivia, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Morris, for your kind words, and also for sharing your personal, very powerful experience in Haiti around the earthquake, which I think in the prison world, it did really kind of highlight tragically how vulnerable people are in places of detention. And we know now that the latest data shows over 11 million people in prison globally, and many of those people are in, living in infrastructure that cannot handle a natural hazard, let alone a system that is ready to respond, as you say. We really look forward to working with you. And I now want to get into the kind of nitty-gritty of the report. So I'm going to turn to my colleague without delay, Jane Rice, who is our Strategy and Impact Manager. Jane led on getting this report published. So congratulations, Jane, to you and all of my other colleagues at PRI. And also we had many contributions and expert input from other people, partners and colleagues around the world to make this guide as relevant as possible. Jane, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Morris Tittlebins, for your, hold on a minute, just want to close out of this. And thank you, Mr. Tittlebins, for your important opening remarks. I'm going to present today the key messages from the Natural Hazards in Prisons Guide. As has been described, the guide is the first of its kind, presenting primarily to prison administrations and staff concrete steps they can take to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, respond to and recover from natural hazards while protecting the rights of people in prison. Next slide. Natural hazards are increasing in frequency and scale due to climate change. Almost 30% of the world's prison population lives in the 12 countries most exposed to natural hazards, and in some of these countries, overcrowding rates stand at 4 or 5 times capacity. We'll never forget Hurricane Katrina in August 2005, which devastated the city of New Orleans. But we also remember that men, women, and children detained at Orleans Parish Prison were left locked in their cells, abandoned by prison officers with rising water levels and without food, water, or ventilation. There was no plan to evacuate them, and when they eventually were, they spent 2 days on a highway overpass before being taken to other detention facilities around Louisiana. The guide includes numerous and more recent examples of how people in prison and staff have suffered unduly, including the example of Haiti in 2010 mentioned by the Special Rapporteur. People in prison and staff have suffered unduly because of the consequences of natural hazards, and these are really exacerbated by poor planning on the part of prison authorities and other government agencies. This guide seeks to remedy this through providing low-cost solutions which demonstrate good prison management practice. Implementing these can help reduce costs in the long term should a natural hazard occur. It costs more to repair and recover from a serious disaster than it does to plan and prepare for one. Next slide, please. So the actual guide is preceded by a number of sections, including, as mentioned, examples of how natural hazards have impacted prisons around the world, as well as key definitions and a section on international frameworks and guidance. There is no international convention on disaster risk reduction, but the human rights of people in detention remain in times of disaster and should be drawn upon in planning and responding. Overarching of these is Article 6 on the, in terms of human rights standards, overarching of these is Article 6 on the right to life from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Nelson Mandela Rules, Bangkok Rules, and Havana Rules all have relevant provisions for times of natural hazards as well. Other guidance includes the Sendai Framework for International Disaster Risk Reduction, which was the first major agreement of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda that provides UN member states with concrete actions to protect development gains from risk of disaster. Disaster risk reduction plans should also contribute and be aligned with the goals and targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. And lastly, there is the Index for Risk Management, which identifies risk dimensions that can be adopted by prison systems when undertaking risk assessments. Next slide, please. So the guide follows the disaster cycle and is divided into sections thusly: planning and prevention, mitigation, preparedness and response, and recovery. The guide presents each section and interweaves examples from countries around the world, and these examples either highlight good practice or illustrate the potential consequences of a need to take proper action. Next slide. So the first section, planning, prevention and mitigation, looks at the importance of having a proper national disaster risk reduction policy, which includes prisons or specifically for prisons. A disaster risk reduction policy should be informed by a comprehensive risk assessment of the country's prisons, including looking at their physical location and exposure to natural hazards, as well as the vulnerability of infrastructure and the prison population. Prison authorities should also take steps to prevent and mitigate the impact of known risks, including ensuring prison infrastructure is not built in high-risk areas, and that where they are renovated and reinforced to withstand the impact of natural hazards. Authorities should also take steps to depopulate prisons and invest in non-custodial sentences, and should urgently address overcrowding, which is one of the main vulnerabilities exacerbating the impact of natural hazards in prisons. Next slide. The next section is on preparedness and response, and this section focuses on very practical steps that prisons can take to prepare for a natural hazard. This includes developing a contingency plan, which is responsive to the particularities of the prison. They should include guidelines on responsibilities of staff, basic procedures such as first aid, communication strategies, plans for emergency supplies, plans for bringing in extra staff, criteria for establishing temporary release mechanisms, and evacuation plans. And these contingency and evacuation plans should be practiced through drills, which involve detainees on a voluntary basis. This ensures that everyone knows what to do in an emergency, and it also prioritizes disaster risk reduction in the prison. In addition, in preparedness planning, prisons must, of course, consider staff working conditions and training. If staff are unsafe and unable to do their jobs, the safety of detainees and overall prison security will deteriorate. While there is scope for people in prison to play a role in disaster risk reduction, both in prisons and in the local community, their participation must be entirely voluntary, and they must have the same rights as people in the community. But their participation can facilitate their rehabilitation. Carly will be talking about this further in her presentation. People in prison should also have a say in prison management. The prisons must be sure not to derogate from their responsibility to protect. Although the measures in this guide are intended to be low-cost solutions, prisons do need more funding to implement proper disaster risk reduction. National governments should provide funding so prisons can improve their ongoing operations and capacity to manage these events. When a natural hazard is known and imminent and about to impact a prison, prisons should enact their contingency and evacuation plans or shelter-in-place plans as appropriate. And prisons must communicate with staff, people in prison and their families about the situation. Prison buildings must be reinforced where possible. Mechanisms for early release should be enacted, and legal documents and files should be stored properly, among other steps. COVID-19 also adds another challenge to disaster risk reduction. Prison authorities need to take steps to ensure that any response is in line with COVID prevention measures, including undertaking drills with COVID restrictions in place, under COVID restrictions, and being mindful that any evacuation conditions, including transport there and the temporary shelter, allow for social distancing. Next slide, please. And lastly, the last section of the guide is recovery, and this looks at short and medium-term recovery and long-term recovery and accountability. If prisons have been destroyed or damaged, safe temporary housing must be sought, which meets minimum standards. Recovery plans should also include provision for people in prison to continue any rehabilitation programs, and there must be special provision made for mental health services. Long-term recovery must include opportunities to address structural issues to avoid future disasters, including addressing overcrowding and creating appropriate detention facilities. The aftermath of disasters should also allow for accountability processes, including on any loss of life. There must be scrutiny for decisions made, as well as justice for any harms done and rights violated. Monitoring and oversight bodies are critical to ensure authorities are held accountable, and people in prison must have access to complaints mechanisms. Prisons can also make use of emergency management debriefs to identify lessons learned and areas for improvement. And a post-disaster needs assessment can also be an essential step to set a path for recovery. Next slide. So that, in summary, is the guide. As my colleague Olivia said, it's available to download now on PRI's website. Please read it and share it widely and send us your feedback. I'll now hand back to Olivia.
Thank you very much, Jane, for summarising quite a comprehensive document in 7 minutes. I think just to add, I really encourage everybody to also look through for the sort of green font where we highlight examples from different areas of the world in different countries, how different responses have been taken and so on. On a more sort of national focus, I would like to turn to our next speaker, Mr. Carlos Zovasquez, who's the former head of INPE, the National Penitentiary Institute of Peru. Examples from Peru, in fact, feature heavily in the guide due to its status as a high-risk country for natural hazards. And so I hand over the floor to you, Carlos, to share how the prison system in Peru, in your country, is working to respond to this high risk with its available resources. Carlos will be presenting in Spanish, so please click over the language channel if you need to.
All right.
No escuchamos.
Ahí se me escucha mejor.
Sí, ahora sí.
En primer lugar, agradecer a
First of all, I would like to thank Penal Reform International for inviting me to speak today. And I'd like to share a presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen. Would you be able to give me permissions to share screen so I can share the PowerPoint?
Bien, gracias.
Thank you. So I'm just going to complement, add to what Jane said, and first of all, echo the praise for this guide, which is going to be very useful for many countries, and especially for us in Peru, and because we have, as you can see in the guide, 50% of incarcerated people in Peru are in areas that are at risk of natural disasters. So one of the main problems that Jane mentioned is overcrowding in prisons. This is undoubtedly one of the biggest, it has one of the biggest impacts on us for our penitentiary systems. Because it's very difficult to implement safety and security policies, and it's difficult to even develop policies for social reintegration as well after prison time. And in Latin America, of the 17 countries in Latin America, Peru is third after Guatemala and Bolivia in the rates of overcrowding. So Peru is the third most overcrowded. So overcrowding, here on the left, we can see how the prison population, which is in blue, is going up, and the yellow, which is the infrastructure and how much capacity there actually it's not keeping up. The prison population is growing at a faster rate. So, and today the prison population has actually grown by 107%. And this is why there's a need for alternative policies. And there's also, in many cases, it's impossible for the states or the government to properly respond. Here we see in the chart the ratio of prison employees to inmates. So we can see it should be only between 4 to 7 inmates per prison employee, based off the information that we have. And we can see that in Peru, each prison employee is responsible for between 12 and 13 people. And each place can have be in charge of even 300 prisoners. So it's quite, we see that there's a big gap here. And when there isn't enough oversight by authorities in contexts where overcrowding is an issue, when there isn't enough oversight, this is kind of covered up or hidden by other populations. So, for example, criminal organizations, internal organizations, external organizations, drug trafficking organizations. In Central America, there's a lot of gangs or paramilitary organizations that they actually will take power. They kind of come to fill in this power vacuum where the state or the government isn't stepping in. And we can see in this chart on the right, the evolution of these organizations from the 80s, mid 80s until today. And we can see how some have almost been eliminated in Peru. But there's others that are continuing to grow. So the reason why I'm giving you all of this information up front is because there's this part of a guide which I think is extremely significant. And the guide is to help prevent and reduce the impact of natural disasters and emergency situations. So one of the low-cost solutions is the need to work with the population, the inmate population. And that's something that that really needs to be done in order to be able to implement these risk reduction policies. Because even if someone is an inmate, they still have a right to life, and it doesn't, just because someone is locked away doesn't mean that they no longer count and their life isn't valid. Life continues even behind bars, so it's important to take accountability for that. And so there's a lot of work that can be done working with the inmate population to work together to prevent and reduce risk for the future. So in 2017, we carried out a national drill or like a national simulation using, with the help of around 85,500 people, including the inmate population. So in the largest prison in Peru, where there's almost 10,000 inmates in 23 different yards. And it's one of the largest prisons in Latin America. So what we did, there's 23 different units within the prison, and they have a structure. They've kind of come in and filled the gap of where the government isn't stepping up. And so they've really organized into teams to respond to basic needs, things like healthcare, education. And they also organize for bad things as well, like planning for potential emergencies. And this really helps to, this kind of collaborative approach really helps to make us more effective at planning for emergency situations. So in 2017, we trained and ran workshops where we formed 6 different concrete, well-defined brigades. So the Orange Brigade were general coordinators of the emergency response. Someone wearing white was a healthcare or someone helping out with the healthcare professionals. Blue was for moving injured people. Someone in the Green Brigade was responsible for moving debris and removing any obstacles. People in the Red Brigade, help with fire hazards and fighting fires. And people in the Black Colored Brigade are responsible for moving the deceased. So that's how the brigades were structured. There's there's a brigade of people who know about healthcare responses. There's people who know how to remove debris, where to move it to. Everybody has knowledge about how to manage a specific portion of the emergency response. So at the national level, we ran a national drill. And we even created a few goals to kind of make it a competition of who could do it in the shortest amount of time, who could do it the quickest, which team. And this was also to help kind of motivate people. So to sum up my presentation, I would like to show you a small video. It's not longer than a minute, just so you can see the largest drill that we ran in Lurigancho, in the prison in Lurigancho, which is the largest one in the country. And it's really a great visualization of how these low-cost solutions truly are solutions that are very effective and that can be used for future.
Gracias y eso es todo por mi parte. Gracias por la invitación.
Thank you, and that's my presentation finished.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and particularly for highlighting the need to work together with people detained in a collaborative approach around preparing and preventing the risks and so on from natural hazards. It's quite impressive the work that you have done with the huge drills involving many people. So thank you for sharing that with us today. I'm conscious of time, so I will move straight on to our next speaker. Welcome, Dr. Carly Purim. Carly is a research assistant professor for the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M University, and her work centers on how hazards and disasters impact incarcerated populations and correctional facilities, with an emphasis on the social vulnerability of such populations, emergency planning and policies in correctional settings. Carly, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation? Great. I'm realizing I can't pull up my notes while sharing my screen, so I'm going to pull them up on my phone very quickly.
No problem.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here with you today to talk about the very important issue of imprisoned workers and disasters and the implications for human rights. Whenever I give presentations about the issue of imprisoned workers and disasters, I like to pull examples of news media headlines just to demonstrate how common the practice is for imprisoned workers to be used in disasters. These are primarily examples from the United States where my work focuses, but there are also some examples from Australia and Indonesia. There are many documented examples of imprisoned workers and disasters across the globe. And while my research has primarily focused here of the practice in the United States, the reasons that imprisoned workers are looked to for disaster labor and the conditions that make them vulnerable are commonplace around the globe. I'm going to start by introducing the topic of imprisoned workers and disasters a bit broadly. Imprisoned and detained persons have been used for disaster labor throughout history, including enslaved persons, persons who are prisoners of war, and persons who are imprisoned as punishment, who I'm primarily talking about with this presentation. Imprisoned workers have been used for many types of disasters, including floods, wildfires, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides, hazardous materials, spills, disease outbreaks. More recently, likely seen examples of imprisoned workers contributing to the response to the COVID-19 pandemic by either manufacturing materials or examples of them digging graves or sanitizing prison facilities, government facilities. Imprisoned workers are used throughout the phases of disasters, including mitigation, which includes actions to prevent or reduce potential disaster impacts. Imprisoned workers may be used to update or repair infrastructure. For example, they may be used to do seismic retrofitting of structures, repairing seawalls, and conducting controlled burns to mitigate wildfire risk. In the preparedness phase, they may be used to manufacture and organize materials, emergency supplies, or reinforce infrastructures. For example, here in the States, imprisoned workers may set up shelters. They organize supplies. They make sandbags and then place those sandbags throughout the community to reduce, to prepare for flooding. In the response phase, imprisoned workers may participate in fire suppression activities. This is the most visible type of labor that imprisoned workers participate here in the States. And there are other nations where they participate in similar programs. They may participate in hazardous materials cleanup and cleaning up oil spills, the collection and disposal of diseased animals, emergency route clearance, where they clear roads to allow emergency vehicles to get into communities, supporting mass care. They may set up mobile kitchens with the prison to help feed evacuees or survivors, and even domestic animal care, where they care for farm animals or even pets from evacuated households. In the recovery phase, imprisoned people are looked to for broad community cleanup efforts, including clearing debris. They work in construction to repair damaged government structures, including schools. They clean up historical sites and replant lost vegetations. There's many other examples of the type of work they do, but those are just some examples to give you an idea of what they may be used for. So why imprisoned workers? What makes imprisoned workers desirable for this type of labor is in direct relationship to their lack of rights. There's a strong relationship between programs that employ imprisoned workers in disasters and that of slavery. From our, here in the States, our Constitution allows for persons who have been convicted of a crime to legally not have the right to work. So when we abolished slavery, there was a exception made for persons who have been convicted of a crime. So they don't have the right to refuse to participate in labor, which is very dangerous in the disaster situation, especially. While much of what I talk about and continue to talk about is observed here in the States, but it's applicable around the world. Imprisoned persons may be punished for not participating. They may be held in solitary confinement, which has been shown to be extremely damaging to mental health. They may be written up for disciplinary infractions, which may impact their chances for early release. Some programs may be voluntary, but if the conditions of the prison are extremely harsh, they may volunteer to do hazardous labor to temporarily escape those conditions. There are policies in the US where some states will allow for time to be taken off a person's sentence if they participate specifically in disaster labor. So there's definitely an incentive there for them to participate. Programs that train imprisoned persons to participate in wildland firefighting are very controversial here, largely because the environment of fire camps is, it's much less brutal than the traditional prison environment, which encourages imprisoned people to participate in that labor. But imprisoned firefighters have also been found to have higher rates of serious injury, and have also been found to not have adequate personal protective equipment while doing that kind of work. Most importantly, they have no right to compensation for their labor, which is really what makes them a desirable workforce for disasters. In the United States, imprisoned persons don't have the right to wages. Some states do provide wages, but imprisoned persons don't have the legal right to wages, especially when they're doing this kind of work. And all of these conditions create a large, accessible and low cost workforce, but an extremely vulnerable one. Imprisoned people are a stigmatized population. They're often expendable because they disproportionately reflect marginalized and oppressed persons, which when there are injuries or even deaths tend to evoke less sympathy from the public compared to when free persons experience those injuries or deaths, such as first responders working in disaster areas. Imprisoned persons may be seen as deserving whatever fate they meet because they had committed a crime. It may whatever their fate, whatever they experience, whether it is death or an injury, it may be framed as even their redemption. They redeem themselves by giving their labor in a disaster. And this leads to very little public attention and even less scholarly attention to how imprisoned people are impacted by disasters, and including imprisoned workers. Disasters are dangerous. There's always a level of uncertainty as to what the risks are for those working in a disaster environment. Disasters present enormous obstacles to protecting human rights of prisoners. And imprisoned workers have been exposed to numerous health and safety violations. If they are health and safety hazards, there are many anecdotal examples of imprisoned workers being seriously injured or even killed while working in a disaster environment. They have unequal access to training and protective equipment, unequal access to quality health care, and their experiences are often invisible to the public at large, their families, and their communities. And this vulnerability also extends to their families and to the communities, in that imprisoned workers, they don't have the same type of compensation for their labor, in terms of compensation if they die for their family, compensation to go to their families, or workers' comp if they are injured. They don't have those same rights that free persons do. And then in turn, something that's often missed in the conversation is that imprisoned persons, when they're used for disasters, they are still, while they're able to contribute to the disaster in some way, it's directed by whatever the government says directs them towards, but they're unable to provide that aid to their families or to their own communities. They're not able to contribute in the way that other community members are, which leads to vulnerability for their family members. It's still a person who's missing from their family unit. So to summarize, the vulnerability of imprisoned workers is enormous and complex. Efforts should be made to reduce the vulnerability, but with deep consideration as to how imprisonment itself creates vulnerability and conditions for exploitation of imprisoned people. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me at this email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carly, for sharing this really important information. And there's a lot of issues that come up in terms of human rights and so on in relation to using people in prison in responding to natural disasters. We are really grateful for all of your work on this topic and all the input you gave to PRI's guide, etc. So thank you for that. We have come to the end of the event. I hope that it has been insightful to all of you who have joined. We thank you very much. We hope that today's discussion, and more importantly, that the guide can be disseminated far by all of us and can really help practically to assist practitioners, civil society, international bodies and so on who are working with correctional facilities, prisons and justice systems globally to really bring some action and some attention to this area, which is so desperately needed. So thank you all to our panel today for your insights and your time, and we look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you very much.